Good evening, everybody. I'm Eugenio Biagini. I am Professor of Modern British and Irish History at Cambridge, and I have been convening or starting this series of webinars together with Barry and now with Niamh Gallagher. We have been running this series for a few months now, and we are delighted to welcome you to this evening discussion, which promises to be very exciting and very exciting for us all. I would like to thank the Center for Geopolitics and Sidney Sussex College for sponsoring and greatly supporting our webinar. And now, without further ado, I'll pass you on to Barry.
Thank you so much, Eugenio. So welcome everybody to this, the 14th meeting in the Cambridge Seminar on the Future of the Island of Ireland. Thank you for being with us. As always, I'm going to briefly explain the format for our event this evening. So in a moment, Ivana Bacik, TD, is going to intervene for up to 10 minutes on her chosen topic, which, just so that I get it right, is developing a human rights culture in Ireland. After this, there's going to be a 20-minute discussion with Professor Lucy Delap, and then this will allow up to 30 minutes for questions and answers from the floor. So Ivana Bacik was first elected to serve in Seanad Éireann, that's the Irish Upper House, in 2007, and was elected to Dáil Éireann in a by-election as city for Dublin Bay South last July. A long-term campaigner for constitutional change in Ireland, Ivana was a leading voice in the marriage equality and repeal the 8th campaigns, and was a prominent student leader in the 1980s and 90s. Ivana is a lawyer and has taught law for many years at Trinity College Dublin. Ivana is currently the Labour Party spokesperson on the environment and climate, children, equality, disability, integration, and youth. Ivana's going to be in conversation with Professor Lucy Delap, Professor of Modern British and Gender History at the University of Cambridge. Professor Delap's research is focused on the history of feminism spanning Britain, the United States, and the British Empire. With colleagues, Professor Delap was awarded the prestigious Royal History Society Public History Prize for Public Debate and Policy in 2018 for their work on child sexual abuse. Without further ado, I'll hand things over to Ivana. Thank you again so much for being with us, and I'm looking forward to your intervention.
Thank you very much, Barry, and thanks for the kind invitation to speak this evening. And thanks also to Niamh and to Eugenio and to Lucy. I look forward to the debate and discussion. And it's a real treat to be invited to speak on the neighbouring jurisdiction, even if it's virtual. So I'm sitting here in my actual bedroom in Dublin. And I suppose just by way of a brief aside on the introduction is to say that like many Irish-based people and Irish people, I probably know a lot more about British politics and history than most British people know about Irish politics and history. It's a feature, I suppose, a legacy of a colonial past and so on. But I also did spend some years living in London after graduation from Trinity, and have followed British politics ever since. So what I will do is when I'm speaking, I'm hoping that what I'll say will also have relevance to an audience based in Britain. I know many of you will be very familiar with Irish politics and culture anyway, but I think this the idea of the human rights culture has a much broader import. Just a final aside about my own background as a law lecturer. I studied law in Trinity in the 80s, as Barry said, and we had some very politically engaged lecturers there. So I like to think I followed that tradition. And indeed, in 89, I and a group of other students were threatened with prison for giving information on abortion to women in crisis pregnancy at a time when that was illegal in Ireland. And we were represented in court by one of our lecturers, Mary Robinson, who went on to become president of Ireland, and she kept us out of prison. So I always say we escaped prison. We didn't escape from prison, which would have been a very different and far more dramatic tale, but we did avoid being sent to prison by dint of Mary's superb legal argument. And so I suppose that inspired me to practice as a lawyer, which I did for many years, and also to teach, and now to be in the Parliament, in the legislature. So I wanted to talk about the development of a human rights culture in Ireland, because we're having that debate here at the moment. And I had a piece published in the Irish Times a few weeks ago about just this. I suppose through the last 20 months, as we've navigated our way through COVID, and again, this isn't unique to Ireland, many of us have been asking about a new human rights culture, a new political culture also. And there's certainly a much greater sense, we feel here, and I think probably elsewhere as well, much greater sense of the value of public services, of the huge strength of having a strong state intervention in not just in health, which and we often have looked traditionally to the NHS in Britain as the real model for a universal health service. We don't have that in Ireland. We still have a two-tier health service, but our state health system has stepped up. And indeed, at certain points during the crisis, we have the state has taken over private hospitals, unprecedented here to have that happen. So we've created a much bigger public health service here than we've ever had. We've also seen the state really stepping up and delivering on interventions, to use your word, Barry, but on interventions to support businesses that are struggling, to support individuals who are out of work because of the pandemic, and the state has delivered all sorts of things, including a freeze on evictions, subsidies for childcare, and the sort of community and public amenities that those of us on the left in Ireland have always looked for but never obtained. So we, you know, and I suppose this became very much to the fore for me and for my party, Labour, which is much smaller than Labour in Britain, hence my lengthy title as spokesperson, because we very few TDs or members of Parliament. Teachtaí Dála is the TD, that is a member of Parliament of the Lower House. We only have 7, and therefore we all hold very lengthy briefs as a result of spokespersons. But for us in Labour, we certainly heard that message about the value of public services, about the central role of the state, very loud and clear in the by-election campaign this summer that Barry referenced. And I suppose I had been a senator in the upper house for some years, 14 years in fact, but this was an election, this was a very different campaign, because this was a campaign to the lower house, to the Dáil or Parliament or lower house of Parliament, and it was also the first and still only election held during COVID times, and the message was very clear. People wanted a left of centre approach. They were looking for a social democratic or socialist voice, and I was elected, and I was very humbled to be elected in a really decisive result. So so we're exploring now, therefore, whether we can envisage a new human rights culture in light of this political shift, as it seems to us, to the left. Not again unique to Ireland, because we're seeing it in other jurisdictions, in other countries, where in Germany, for example, in Norway, where we're seeing left-wing parties gaining more votes in the few elections we've had post or during COVID. But we've also had moments like this before, albeit not at the same level as the sort of devastating effect of COVID. But we have seen in Ireland, certainly, human rights cultural shifts taking place. And again, to reference Barry's introduction, we've had the experience of a number of really pivotal referendum campaigns on issues like marriage equality in 2015, which was passed by a big majority, and women's reproductive rights in 2018, that the so-called repeal the 8th referendum, which paved the way for legal abortion in Ireland at last in 2018, after many decades of illegality. And we've also seen it. So those referendums, we saw people's votes and popular campaigns leading to big shifts in what had been perceived as public opinion, bucking a trend elsewhere, perhaps, where we're seeing a rowing back on human rights. We've also seen in Ireland, because we have a written constitution and a written Bill of Rights since 1937, we've seen certain judgments, which again, in my argument, have really helped to embed a human rights culture. Some famous cases in Ireland: the Maureen de Burke case on women's right to serve on juries in the 1970s, the David Norris case on decriminalisation of homosexuality in the 80s, or the Lydia Foy case on transgender rights in the 90s. And these are key public interest litigation moments that again have helped to embed greater awareness of human rights concepts. I'm conscious, having described those moments, that of course, when we talk about those human rights, that sort of human rights development, we're talking about a relatively narrow interpretation of rights, civil and political or individual-based rights or freedoms, rather than what we call the second generation rights, the economic and social rights that are more closely associated with the left of centre or a socialist ideology. So the widely, and sometimes when I'm talking with law students, we start from the premise that most people have a widely accepted view of human rights, that they're universal, they're derived from natural law, that there is an accepted body of rights. And of course, then we have to unpick that and talk about the different generations of rights, the different conceptions and the different political ideologies that frame the different rights. So we talk about those civil and political rights, such as the right to free speech, that really guarantee individuals freedom against the abuses of public or state power. But those are first generation rights, typical to liberal democracies and associated with neoliberal ideology. Marxist and feminist writings refer more to the second generation, the social and economic rights, such as the right to housing, for example, that place positive burdens on the state. And Marxist and feminist writings have also developed influential critiques of rights. And again, I know in Britain, there's been a much more lively debate about this, about whether enshrining rights into constitutions can divert power from democratically elected public representatives and instead invest power in the hands of an elite group of judges drawn from very homogenous backgrounds and can only confer power on those individuals who are wealthy enough to be able to take cases to court. So that is certainly a very valid critique of rights, albeit one that I think can be contested when we look at, as I say, the use of bills of rights in Ireland and elsewhere to form the basis for public interest litigation. And also when we look at how our civil society movements have recognized the rhetorical power of rights discourse and the symbolic importance of the use of rights-based language. And that is why I think it is useful to still rely on rights discourse, to talk about a new human rights culture, and indeed to develop that further to the third generation view of rights through the campaigns of environmental activists, for example, where we see the community-based rights being given voice and effect. And, you know, I was lucky enough in the 80s to be lectured by Kader Asmal, who was a leading light of the Irish anti-apartheid movement and who became a Minister for Education in one of the first post-ANC governments. And he famously wrote the first draft of the current South African constitution, which enshrines those three different conceptions of rights and which has given recourse to citizens groups and to collective rights like linguistic rights or community rights. So I suppose I just wanted to finish, Barry, by saying that I think through the NGO community at international level, through climate movements, we're seeing rights discourse being invested with new meaning. Through recent changes in Ireland and through changes internationally with this new emphasis on the role of the state to tackle the pandemic, we've seen a new reimagining of rights and a new embedding of rights discourse and rights language. We've had a very interesting new phenomenon in Ireland, the Constitutional Convention and Citizens' Assembly deliberative democracy processes. And I was privileged to participate in the process in 2013, which paved the way for holding the referendum on marriage equality. More recently, we saw a similar model used to pave the way for the abortion referendum. And earlier this year, the Citizens' Assembly produced a powerful 45 recommendation blueprint for action on gender equality. And I've just been appointed chairperson of the Oireachtas, or Parliamentary Committee, which will examine how we are going to implement those recommendations. So for me, that's a real test. Can we actually move to that embedding of human rights culture using the blueprint that the Citizens' Assembly has developed and really informed by a citizen's understanding of human rights? So I suppose I want to finish there and just say that in this way I hope we can move beyond COVID or through COVID to create a more equal and inclusive society in which different generations of human rights can be valued for all. Thank you. Or Gura Magwev in Irish.
Thank you very much, Ivana, for that. I'll hand you straight over to Lucy.
Thanks very much, Ivana. Really interesting. I wanted to jump in with a question about rights and the way in which human rights has become so sort of center stage to a lot of these profound transformations that you've been describing to us. And it's clear to me that just describing some of these moments of social change through that rhetoric of human rights is a very helpful way of drawing some of the poison out of debates which previously had seen sort of opposed groups. I'm thinking here of the changes around reproductive rights and reproductive justice and feminism. Cast as feminism, it was always seen as a kind of, a conflictual site of politics. Cast as human rights, there's been more consensus behind it. But really, this is a question about how much weight can the human rights discourse bear? Do you think it's up to the job of mediating all of these different, these different sites of politics that you've been describing to us, housing, environmental justice, reproductive justice, and so on? Is human rights going to be the key to unlocking all of these places, or does it have some problems for us?
Thanks, Lucy. That's a great question. I think you've cut to the heart of one of the issues. And I've certainly myself been quite have come round to I think, a more to being more emphatic about asserting rights discourse as a way to make change. For a long time, I was much more persuaded by the, I suppose, the more traditional socialist view that human rights were for the wealthy, you know, that really the rights were meaningless without the power to implement them, the Marxist argument, and that you know, Western developed countries' bills of rights tended to enshrine only civil and political rights, and not, for example, collective rights like the right to collective bargaining for trade union movements and so on. So so I've come around to that view, I think largely because of some of the changes we've had, but I would still agree that rights discourse can't be the only vehicle on which you seek to bring about change. And certainly in the abortion debate in 2018, we were very conscious that that binary rights debate can be, in fact, can be counterproductive. It's certainly, there's been some very interesting research here by people like Catherine Conlon about, you know, speaking with and interviewing women who'd had abortions, who'd had crisis pregnancies and had terminations, and talking and how they felt excluded from this rights-based language, that they were making decisions that were much more nuanced in their approach, and that they were, for example, quite often very much willing to describe the pregnancy as a baby, but a baby they couldn't keep. So it wasn't that they felt they had a right to choose, rather that they had no choice. So in the referendum campaign itself, again, it's quite well documented. We used narrative and storytelling and reach out to empathy and to compassion to a far greater extent than we actually used rights language. I was on the national executive of Together for Yes, which was the main coalition civil society group arguing for a yes vote in 2018. And we could see the appeal of that, where we weren't saying to people, it's black and white, it's either reproductive rights or not, or, you know, either right to choose or pro-life. So that nuanced approach certainly, I think, helped to bring about the change. So I think you're right, you can't just use rights language. And those cases I mentioned, in many instances, they were part of a much broader movement that was just using litigation as one polemical tool, if you like, but not the only one.
Thanks. And that leads us on really, really nicely to another question I had for you, Ivana. You mentioned kind of trust in the state and how COVID had enhanced a sense of people wanting to see a more interventionist state. And yet trust has been really in question across the whole world, really. Who do we trust in the face of various different kinds of populist politics and the real challenge of the pandemic conditions? And in some ways, we've seen a transformation of our politics in many different places in ways that suggest that trust is in really short supply. And that has generated debates about kindness, about compassion, as you just mentioned. And, you know, where do we look for kindness in public life in what is often a very polarized political landscape?
Okay, yeah, there's loads there. I mean, I suppose we don't, and I can see Barry laughing, I don't think in Ireland, or Niamh and Barry will agree, I don't think in Ireland we would see ourselves as particularly trusting of authority, and yet we have actually had the highest vaccination rates in Europe. So there's I think here it's really interesting, that idea of trust. Here there's been a lot of surprised comment about just how trusting as a citizenry we are with these high vaccination rates. And actually we've got 93% of the population over 12 is vaccinated. I mean, enormous take up. Voluntary, it's not compulsory for anyone, but there's been an amazing public health messaging. And I mean, you know, the government is centre-right government. We're an opposition party, but we've all supported the vaccination effort, and there hasn't been there hasn't really been a strong political voice against it. But we have some evidence that vaccination rates are lower in more marginalised groups, particularly groups of new communities, particularly from Central and Eastern European states. My own family background is Czech, I should say. So, but certainly that seems to be an issue, that issue about trust and authority. And I suppose it definitely feeds into the political discourse and the level of kindness, compassion, or otherwise, or toxicity in political debate. And I think here many of us in opposition have really tried to keep the debate respectful. Actually, this summer, the by-election campaign one of the big things we said was we're going to be positive. We're not going to attack any other party at all. Absolutely. I just had an absolute thing about it because I've been exposed to so much vicious stuff over the years, particularly being pro-choice in Ireland in the 80s and 90s. So we just ran a positive campaign and we made a big virtue out of that. And it really worked. It really resonated. There's such ugliness in the political debate, particularly online, that I think people really like the fact that we were knocking on doors. We were only putting a positive message. We wouldn't engage in negativity.
And Ivana, do you feel as though you really bypassed the kind of social media online world? Do we have political spaces that give us like alternative ways of going forwards politically?
Well, I'm very wedded to Twitter. I'm all over Twitter like a rat. But I find it, it's a very useful tool for getting messaging out there. It's a very democratic tool, but at the same time, there is an awful lot of nasty debate, a lot of misogyny, a lot of abuse that goes on Twitter because of the anonymity of it. We did try and bypass it though, as much as possible, but you have to engage. You have to engage. Obviously, you have to be on social media. But we just, again, we had, our WhatsApp groups. We just said to people, please don't engage in to and fro. Please don't engage in aggressive debate on Twitter or on any social media app. So we just asked our campaigners not to.
So the kind of the human rights discourse that you've outlined for us, do you feel like it's a kind of ratchet where it can't go back once you've established these rights, or do you feel like it's a kind of tide that's coming in and out and we could see it going out again in the future?
I would never be complacent about it. I think we've seen in the US where there's been just endless attempts to roll back Roe v. Wade, the danger of becoming complacent or just relying on a battle won. And certainly we are now about to undergo a review of the abortion legislation. And certainly there's already a pushback looking to try and make the legislation more restrictive. Obviously, there's many of us trying to make it less restrictive too. And I think so far the momentum is with us. But yeah, I think there is a pendulum in this, and we do have to be careful about it and keep making the arguments. And certainly in Ireland, it's so unusual for us, now to be portrayed in international media as a bastion of progressive values. And for so long, we were the other way, and we were looking to everyone else for, lessons or models on women's rights and on LGBT rights. It's a really bizarre feeling, certainly for someone my age, 53, to have grown up in the 80s and to suddenly see Ireland being trumpeted as a progressive place. It is a progressive place now, but it has changed.
It's something to celebrate, absolutely. So Ivana, tell us a bit more about the deliberative democracy, because you've been describing these different sites where political debate is happening and where change might be expected to happen. We know something about some of them, but deliberative democracy is particularly innovative. How does it work? How do you see it kind of inserting itself into Irish politics?
Well, it's been very interesting, our model has been reviewed internationally, but we were looking at other models elsewhere, actually in Canada in particular, in 2011 when Labour entered government, and I think we can take credit, it was a Labour innovation. We wanted to see change made on marriage equality, in other words, on laws equalising marriage rights between same-sex and opposite-sex couples. But in 2011, when Labour came into office, that was seen as a very controversial position. The majority coalition party, the Fine Gael, were not willing to agree to that. But the compromise was that we would set up this constitutional convention, which was the first iteration of our deliberative democracy process. So we set that up. I was on it because at the time what we did was have it divided between citizens chosen randomly, but representatively from the electoral register, and elected public representatives from Dáil and Seanad, both houses of parliament. So it was a fascinating process. I sat on it for a year and a half, and we deliberated on a number of different things, but notably on marriage equality. And we heard presentations from experts, we heard stories from those affected by laws, and ultimately the Citizens' Assembly, or the convention as it was, recommended we hold a referendum on marriage equality, and that went on to be held in 2015. And I suppose the process had been seen as so successful and so effective in providing a space free of shouting and free of sensationalism, an evidence-based space to debate ideas calmly. That was the real merit of it. I could see people's minds changing on things as we went through it. And so as a result, because of the success and because there's a lot of interest internationally, the next government, of which Labour weren't a part, in 2016, set up a similar process, but just citizens this time. So it's 100 citizens chaired by an eminent, actually a former civil servant, Catherine Day, who's really super. And she has presided over now a number of different assemblies, a great one on climate change, and now the most recent one on gender equality. So I think it's become a semi-permanent fixture now of our political life. And it's a way of taking the heat out of controversial debates and looking at the evidence on particular issues, and then coming to a series of recommendations which then go to Parliament and government.
Yeah, a very exciting prospect given the kind of heated nature of lots of our political life. So where next, Ivana? Where do you think you'll see progress made or human rights issues kind of popping up the agenda?
Well, we have a whole range of different recommendations on gender equality that we have to look at. A few of them are, some of them are more, you might call them more civil and political, like removing sexist language in our constitution. Still there, our constitution still recognises women as having a life within the home and mothers as having duties in the home, and no such equivalent for fathers or men. So that's I think much more straightforward. But we also are going to be looking at childcare, how to implement a universal childcare scheme, how to bring about a change in the gender pay gap that continues sort of persistent here. We've only just passed legislation. I know you have it in place for some years now in Britain, and so we have a whole and elder care. So a lot of focus on care, actually, on the rights of care and of carers and of the cared for, and some debate actually over whether we should enshrine a recognition of care into our constitution. But I think many of us are concerned about, the unforeseen consequences if you set up, for example, what can become a hierarchy of rights. And that's what happened with abortion. The referendum that was passed in '83 that prohibited abortion effectively had equated rights to life of the mother and the unborn, and it had set up there for a hierarchy where if one was in conflict with the other, the courts had to intervene. So we don't want to see that sort of conflictual potential coming in with care-based rights. So we're going to be looking at that very carefully. So there's a whole range of different human rights issues.
Very interesting. And care for politicians is a bit like kittens. Nobody wants to come out against care. Sure. But the question really is, how do we adequately recompense carers? And certainly in British debates, that is a huge question at the moment. And it feels as though for all the esteem that carers are offered, there's no real change in their kind of social status, and no real desire to raise wages or improve conditions in the care sector. I don't know if Ireland is facing similar debates.
Yeah, we watched the debate over with you about the clapping for carers and the clapping for frontline staff, and there was similar, and then sort of the lack of any substantive recognition, as you say. And we've had the same debate about how do you recognise the incredible heroism and bravery of frontline workers, and who even are those frontline workers? There's been a lot of debate, and it's right now we're looking at an extra public bank holiday next year for everyone. So I think that's what we're going to see, rather than any sort of financial recompense, because it became too difficult. It became mired very quickly in who were the frontline workers and who would be rewarded and how could you ever reward them. So, yeah, so that same debate really has gone on.
Barry, do you want to bring in any questions?
Thank you very much, Lucy. I will. So what I'm going to propose doing is, there's one question in from the floor that I'd like to put to you, Ivana. Then I have one or two myself. And then I'll go back to yourself, Lucy, and then Eugenia and Niamh is still there in case you have anything you want to put. So, Ivana, the question comes from John Cushnahan, who's someone you probably know. So former
Hi, John.
Former Fine Gael MEP. So I'm going to ask John's question, and I actually have a small thing to attach to it. So John says, yesterday's opinion poll results in the Republic of Ireland on voting intentions for United Ireland depressingly demonstrated a marked reluctance, especially among younger voters, to make any concessions to a unionist minority in a future United Ireland. What proposals would you suggest are necessary to protect the unionist identity and culture if this were to happen? To that, wow. Sorry, Ivana, just add something small that more broadly, as well as kind of John's specific question, how might a human rights approach inform any discussion on United Ireland? Thanks, Ivana.
I think it's a great question, and thank you very much, John, and good to see you and thank you for joining us. Huge respect for John's experience. And I agree with you, in fact, about that opinion poll. It was of interest and of concern for a number of reasons, not least what you mentioned, but also, I suppose, for me, and certainly for the headline writers, it exposed the difference between the aspiration to United Ireland and the actual commitment to doing anything substantive to change, to make it come about, or to make it an actual reality, that would work for everyone on the island. So there was a very significantly reduced majority in favour of United Ireland when asked would people be willing to pay extra taxes to pay for it. So it was a funny kind of an opinion poll. I think it's probably not surprising about that distinction with younger voters that you mentioned when we look at support for Sinn Féin, which I haven't mentioned, but obviously, the political landscape in Ireland has changed remarkably, and currently Sinn Féin are the biggest opposition party, and currently in opinion polls, probably the second biggest party, if not the biggest. Fine Gael remaining just ahead, I think, in most polls, and Fine Gael obviously being the centre-right party that are, or centre, depending on what way you look at it, who are in government with Fianna Fáil currently, and the Green Party. So it's an interesting coalition. And we are Labour, the second biggest opposition party, but there's a massive difference. We have 7 seats and Sinn Féin have 37, so they are right up. And many commentators think poised to form the next government. My own view actually is that that's not such a inevitability. We're, I think, about 3 years at least from the next general election, and Sinn Féin's remarkably good result, positive result in the last general election, which was February 2020, I think was as a result of a number of particular factors that may not be borne out next time. Their vote tends to be more volatile and fluid. I'd be interested if anyone else has a different view of that. But certainly, if you look at their results in the 2019 local elections, they did very poorly. And they, as a result, don't have the critical mass of councillors that is normally forms a bedrock here for to sort of predict success in the next general election. It's the same with Britain, of course. Your local elections can be predictors of national trends and so on. So with Sinn Féin, it's been very different. You had June 2019, very poor results, as a result of which they actually withdrew candidates and didn't stand enough candidates in February 2020 to make the gains they could have made. They could have had a lot more than 37 seats, judging by the results. So it was an odd one, but just to finish on John's point about the United Ireland issue, there was one of the things I think that really swayed a lot of people to vote Sinn Féin, and unfortunately, in my view, in February 2020 was a big controversy about commemorations of the Black and Tans, and a sort of a folk memory of terrible abuses by at a particular point in Irish history. And that, I think, fed into a sort of a pro-nationalist, pro-Sinn Féin vote that might just have been of its time. But that's my own view. I mean, we've had a lot of debate here, of course, around commemorations, because we are in a decade of different centenaries, including some very difficult centenaries around the civil war that we had in Ireland 100 years ago. So John, I'd love to hear what you think about what I've said.
And indeed, John knows we're informal enough here that if he wants to respond to Ivana in any way, you know how to reach us. But just remind our audience, I have another question to put to you in a moment, Ivana, but those in attendance, please do, if you want to put a question to Ivana, please use the questions and answers box. What I'm going to do is put another question to you from the floor. There's a few topics that I'd like to speak to you about. I want to put a question, if time, on housing, one on the EU and one on the Labour politics. But what I'll do before that is give colleagues Eugenio and Niamh a chance to contribute. But I'm going to read the question from Cairo Kane. It's a short one. How can human rights campaigns and campaigners in North and South, so in Northern Ireland and the Republic, help one another?
Well, we do. I mean, it's a great question, because we do help each other. We had, in 2018, standing up on the stage in Dublin Castle when we were marking the amazing 66.4% majority in favour of women's right to choose, that referendum. And one of the biggest banners in the big crowd in 2018 here in Dublin was "The North is next." So we were very conscious that, all of us campaigning here in this jurisdiction, that there was another jurisdiction on the island that ironically had been less restrictive in its laws up until 2018, and then with our vote became more restrictive. So in fact, women used to travel from most women who needed abortion in Ireland would travel to England. to London or to Liverpool over the many years when it was illegal here. But for some women who had a fatal fetal diagnosis here, they would go to the north where abortion was permissible on that ground. Although the 1967 Act, the Abortion Act, had never extended to the north, and that's something that many people in Britain don't know, but the Abortion Act 1967 never extended to the north, but there were judgments that had enabled doctors in the north to carry out terminations where necessary to save the life or health of a woman, where they couldn't in our jurisdiction in south of the border. So anyway, so the tables turned after 2018, and the north remains more restrictive now on abortion than we are here. So we are working with our sisters and brothers in Northern Ireland on that campaign, as on many others. I mean, on marriage equality, there was a similar to and fro, you know, where civil partnership had come in one and not in the other jurisdiction. So but it's certainly now, you know, as I say, tables have turned, and we would be seen as more progressive on social issues in the south, in this part of the island. So we're working with Northern campaigners. The Good Friday Agreement had a clause that was supposed to be equivalence of rights protections north and south, and there was a lot of work done on a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland at one point. It seems to, I remember going up to Belfast and speaking on a thing there. So, but actually, I'm just trying to think what happened with that. There was a lot of debate around this sort of the optimism immediately following the Good Friday Agreement and the ceasefires. There was a lot of discussion about how we could physically move to a kind of a common recognition of rights, but it's dissipated somewhat, I think, in the years since.
And actually, Ivana, if I can just add onto that question from Cairo Kane about, so that was about north-south participation. Can you say anything about east-west cooperation over recent years? Are you aware of any kind of change in dynamic or nature between human rights campaigners across the two islands?
Yes, absolutely. And I suppose we could sum it up with one word, which is the word we haven't yet mentioned, of Brexit. I mean, that's certainly shifted relations, you know, and for many of us, certainly on the left in Ireland, we would have looked always to Britain for, you know, where you have had always a much bigger socialist or left or social democratic party, where, you know, the left had obviously many times actually had been in government without being a tiny coalition partner. So very different politics. And we'd often, you know, we would have in the 80s and 90s aspired to that. In fact, I was living in London when Neil Kinnock's Labour Party were poised, as we all thought, to be victorious in '92 and were then pipped by John Major. So we've always followed British politics. But I think, you know, with Brexit, there was a real shift where for many, you know, many of my friends living in England, many of the people I would have been in college with in London, who were so disappointed and distressed at the outcome of Brexit, at the outcome of that referendum, which they saw as really showing a very different side, a much less progressive side. So I feel that you know, that has shifted relations, where we were always perhaps feeling we were less progressive. I think there's now a sense on terms of human rights protections that Ireland has moved into a different place vis-a-vis Britain. We do always compare ourselves, of course. You'll know, Barry, and you'll know that, of course. You know, I studied law, as you know, here, and we study basically English law, and then the English legal system, which we inherited, and then the Irish Constitution and Irish cases post-independence. But, you know, I went over and practiced as a barrister in London because it's quite easy to transfer if you've done an Irish law degree, because you essentially know all about English law too. So we follow legal and political developments very closely.
It was 37 minutes in before anyone mentioned the B word, actually.
Oh, that's a record, I guess.
Yeah. So look, perfect timing. Professor Biagini, perhaps you have questions, if not.
Thank you, Barry. In fact, I have a couple of questions.
Fantastic.
Ivana, I really enjoyed, first of all, I admire your progress in Irish politics. I've been cheering you along on the way to success. And I must say, before then, in fact, as early as 1998, I started to teach about these things when I had a lecture every year on Mary Robinson, and an extraordinary career and a giant-like position in Irish and European and global politics. Really, a person stands out in world history. You talked to us very eloquently and in a very inspiring way about the progress of human rights at various levels. But there are two areas, at least, which I think Ireland, not only Ireland, but certainly Ireland lags behind. And one is the position of travelers. Now, travelers are not just a social group, they're also an ethnic group. And this makes the position in which they are in terms of social deprivation, in terms of life expectancy, in terms of access to services, all the more shameful, I must say. And I wonder what the government is doing, what your party is doing, what you think should be done over the next few years to remedy this particular problem, which is an ancient one. It goes back, certainly goes back to the creation of the Irish Free State, and probably, in fact, certainly well before then. And the other area is anti-Semitism. Alan Shatter had an important article in the Irish Times this morning in which he highlighted the extent of the problem. Anti-Semitism in the Irish Republic is again embarrassing. I was in Dublin. I used to take my students to Dublin every year before going on research leave. I'm still on research leave. And the last time, every year we went to the Irish Jewish Museum. And the last time we went, there were all sorts of banners hanging around protesting against the extension of the museum. And these banners were violently anti-Semitic in a way that I found profoundly embarrassing as a friend of Ireland. And also my students found altogether perplexing. Well, I wonder, how would you respond to Alan Shatter's article in today's Irish Times, and how would you address the concerns of the Jewish community, among other things, with reference to the Jewish Museum?
Thanks very much, Eugenio, and I'm glad you raised those points. I mean, I would hate to think, especially as an opposition politician, that I'm making Ireland sound like it's a bastion of progressiveness on everything, because of course it's not, and we're highly critical of the government on housing, and homelessness is a really shameful issue for us. I mean, we have a very, very poor record of housing. Our people, on health, as I said, we still have a two-tier health system, so a really unequal health system. So we're falling very poorly behind on quite a number of different metrics, and cost of living is a huge issue here as well. So we have a lot of poverty. That's the reality. And in terms of travellers and the traveller community, you're quite right to say, if you're looking at disadvantaged groups in Ireland, on every study, particularly on health, which I think you mentioned specifically, travellers are really, really disadvantaged and marginalised, and there's been a very, very slow I suppose, provision for travellers, for housing or for healthcare for travellers. It's something we've pushed for in Labour as a smaller opposition party. We pushed for recognition of travellers as an ethnic minority, and that did eventually come about I was on the Justice Committee when we recommended that it wouldn't take a change in the law, just a declaration by the Minister, which is what happened. So that was one, I suppose, symbolic step forward some years ago, but it's still, in terms of actual provision, it's still very poor. Some of the problem, as you may know, is actually kind of similar to the Jewish Museum, which is about local objections to traveller halting sites. So central government designates funding for local authorities to provide housing for travellers, because housing is, again, a really huge issue. And the local authorities tend not to use the funding. So this has been a kind of a scandal simmering along. Some local authorities just don't use it, because once they start to develop traveller sites, there'll be loads of objections from local communities. So it's a kind of so you have the circular problem. So we're trying to contest that, or I suppose challenge that, by trying to promote more positive attitudes, trying to challenge anti-traveller discrimination. We actually do have strong equality laws, and traveller identity is one of the grounds of discrimination, one of the 9 recognised grounds. But again, it's quite embedded. You're right. It's a really endemic issue, and it's been around for a long time. So to keep working out, I have to say there's some brilliant traveller representatives who are now very vocal on change from within the community. So you have, for instance, Davy Joyce, who's first traveller to qualify as a barrister, and a friend of mine, now a solicitor. And he's been very, very articulate, very vocal about trying to change things. And you have also in the Dáil, in the lower house of Parliament, one of the Sinn Féin TDs, Padraig McLaughlin, who's spoken many times about his family origins, settled travellers. So there's more powerful voices coming forward. And Rosaleen McDonough, who's a playwright, a traveller with a disability, is very, very prominent as well. On the anti-Semitism question, yeah, I saw Alan Shatter's article. Actually, I was in the middle of things today and didn't actually get to read it yet, but I know his argument. And I think we have to be really careful, particularly on the left in Ireland, of not falling into what we might describe as the Jeremy Corbyn trap of using any sort of anti-Semitic tropes or language. There's a there's a long history in Ireland of support for the Palestinian people, but that shouldn't and isn't the same as that. It should be absolutely separated from anti-Semitism in my view. So I've always been a supporter of the Palestine solidarity campaigns here, but also really strongly and I hope an advocate for those who are standing against anti-Semitism. I live actually very few streets away from the Irish Jewish Museum. A number of us did object to its expansion because of the scale of the development on a small residential street. The plans were to bring in 50,000 visitors a year, and it was simply the street is simply not, in my view, as a local public rep, wasn't going to be able to take the volume that was predicted. We thought it would have been better to build it somewhere else. In the end, it's a beautiful little museum. I mean, I visited it, I know some of the people who run it, and it's really, really like a little jewel of a museum in its own space. But I'm not sure about the development that was proposed. There's a lot of resistance in the area. But I think it wasn't based in anti-Semitism, and I think it would be wrong to suggest it was. There was much more concern about cars and coaches on the streets, so it's a little more complicated maybe than it appeared. As it happened, that they got permission in the end to develop the site, but it hasn't actually been.
The community was intimidated. The banners said, "You are neighbors from hell," and the idea that this museum, which has, I will be working there on the day after tomorrow, and you have to make a special appointment because there is no staff. The idea that it would be 50,000 a year, I don't know where it comes from, but if there are 50 a month, I would have been really impressed. Certainly in all my acquaintance with it, which stretches over 10 years now, I've never seen anybody else. Perhaps once I saw another visitor except the people I was taking into the museum around, about 6-7 people at a time, no more, and by special appointment. So I'm really not convinced that this was a threat to the environment, and especially the tone of the banners. Well, in this country, I think the police would have stepped in. And in Germany, it would have been a criminal offense. And I think that is how it should be treated.
Well, they had an open day actually recently to try and have more better relations with the community, or sorry, pre-COVID, I should say, not recently, 2 years ago. But, and that was great, and it really did, I think, help to heal things. The banners, I agree with you, I didn't like those. No, I didn't like the language or the rhetoric on those.
Thanks so much, Ivana. Eugenio, I want to give enough time to Niamh and also a question through for myself. Do you have anything further you want to put to Ivana, or are you happy there? Thanks, Eugenio. Niamh.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ivana. I've really enjoyed this discussion so far. I want to just change tack ever so slightly and just ask you a few more general questions, which I'm sure some of the attendees might be interested in. Clearly you've been an academic for a part of your life, and indeed a practicing barrister too. So I wonder, what do you think academics can bring to political life more generally? And is this a peculiarly Irish contribution, or do you think academics more generally can contribute to the bigger questions?
Oh yes, I don't think this is to do with just Ireland, absolutely not. I think it's really important that academics do contribute in the public sphere, that we, if I can say we or they, are uniquely placed to do so, because it's the universities and colleges, third level, encourage that freedom of speech, that freedom of discourse, and protection. There's a huge safety in being an academic and being able to speak out. I was hired actually in Trinity, in my first job there, by a leading light in the anti-abortion movement, William Binchy, who's actually a very close colleague and friend. And but he and I had absolutely vehement public debates and arguments, and on media and in the university. So it was, to me, it was enormously, I suppose, supportive actually, to know that here was a voice from the completely opposite side, of the debate, you know, who had as much free academic freedom as I did to express his view in the public sphere. So I think it's a real privilege to be an academic. I love it. I mean, I miss it, you know, and happily loads of my colleagues are vocal in public debate too. But I think it's really good to see.
Yeah, and I think, wouldn't it be fair to say in Ireland, I think academics in some ways are more valued as public speakers and as people who engage with the public, more so than in Britain. That would at least be my view. I mean, maybe Lucy wants to say a bit about that too. But we're often called out to speak about various things. I can certainly speak about being on so many centenary panels in the recent past, where that you're sort of that medium between the profession to the institution, but also public life. And I think there's a respect there amongst the public for what academics have to say, which perhaps is more unique and unusual than we really think. So on that note, I wonder if I can just ask a bit more about Irish Labour. I think many people who might be attending today don't really know much about the Irish Labour Party. They don't really know its history. And I wonder if you might be able to tell us a bit about maybe the similarities or crossovers you have between the British Labour Party, or Labour in sort of its philosophy, maybe not the current party, but you can comment on that, and what differences there might be as well.
Well, thanks, Niamh. Interesting point about Britain and Ireland and different views of academics. I'd be interested to know what others think of that. So the Irish Labour Party is the oldest political party in the state, founded by James Connolly, who was one of the 1916 rising protagonists here. So he was a nationalist and a socialist, and he was executed in 1916, but the party went on to be the party of the trade union movement. So Jim Larkin was another of the sort of founding members, and Tom Johnson, who was the leader in 1919, devised a democratic program, which was seen as a sort of social democrat charter for economic and social rights, really, you know, ahead of its time, and certainly which fed into the drafting of what became the Irish Constitution. But the party has always been small. So relative to Britain, the big difference with British Labour is the size and the proportionate size. We've never been able to be a majority partner in a government, let alone be a sort of a standalone government party. Our biggest result was in 2011 with 37 seats. We went into government as a small coalition partner with Fine Gael. The crash happened. The policies that were taken as a result of the crash, Ireland was obviously in an IMF bailout, so policies were pretty draconian, and we lost all but 30 out of those seats in 2016 and have never really recovered. So we've got 7 seats. This result, my by-election result this summer, was our first positive result in some time. So I'm not blowing my own trumpet, like it was a huge amount of Labour people who came and activists who became involved. So we're building back, I suppose, but we want to see as a strong voice for the left. My own politics are red-green, as in environmental, not nationalist, and I would like us to have a more of a formal alliance with other left of centre parties and with the Green Party, although the Green Party are currently in government, obviously with two centre-right parties. So it's complicated, but we're certainly seeking to build back and seeking to get into a position where, if not in the next election, certainly the one after, we would have enough seats to be able to have a strong voice in a government, and hopefully in a government that would be left of centre. We don't see Sinn Féin as a left of centre party. They're more populist. For them, it's nationalism over economic policy. Some of their economic policies would be left wing or perceived as such, but they're against the property tax, which for us is a kind of a fairly sort of good barometer, and they're also against a carbon tax, which again, from an environmental perspective, is kind of hard to justify, we think. So and obviously United Ireland for them is the main priority. For us, it's not. For us, it's economic and social policies first. So that's a quick potted biog of the Labour Party, currently led by my colleague Alan Kelly.
That's very, very helpful, yes. And just speaking slightly more about this constitutional issue, often on these seminars, we get people asking about the big constitutional question, about what a United Ireland might look like, what a new Ireland might look like, what about Northern Ireland, what about minorities, etc. And clearly this is a political question, a big political question. I'm certainly not diminishing it, but it is one of several political questions. And I wonder what your view is in terms of many people putting this question above all others when it comes to thinking about Ireland from an external point of view. do you think this is the big question that people should always ask when it comes to thinking about Ireland, or what indeed can be done to think about that question in a slightly better way?
Yeah, very interesting. I can see why it is the big question for those who aren't familiar with Ireland, who know about us from a distance. It's the obvious question, I suppose, is about a united Ireland and about the border, because for so long it was what was defining when Ireland was in the news internationally. I think, that the imperative, though, both internationally and nationally, is really diminished since the Good Friday Agreement and the very welcome peace process, that now we've got a very harmonious coexistence for the most part on the island. Obviously, there's still it's still flaring up from time to time in the north, but obviously some crossover here in the south as well, but generally it's harmonious. And I think our lessons really from the referendum campaigns we've had is that while most of us, myself included, do aspire to united Ireland, it's not a priority for my party, nor for most parties on the island. And I think most people, even a lot of the more thinking people in Sinn Féin, would agree that if a referendum were to be held at some point, there would have to be a really, careful lead-in process, the sort of deliberative democracy process that we have seen so effectively engaged in prior to those referendums I've described, that really took the heat out of the debate as much as it could be. So I think that for United Ireland, I think that's the message, is that's the sort of preparatory work that would have to be done. And of course it would have to be done you'd have to have consent. I mean, it's huge. John Cushion's question about the unionist minority, that's the other big issue, is how do you manage that if there's a very, very significant minority, for example, who do not want to or are opposed. So I think the principle of consent on which the Good Friday Agreement is based is absolutely essential. So it's hard to see a border poll, as it's called. It's hard to see that happening in the very immediate future, whatever Sinn Féin say. And I think that would be a very difficult question for them if and when they do get into government in Dublin, is how do you bring that about without either resurrecting the Troubles or without really disenfranchising a very significant group. So it's a really difficult question, but I can see why it's still being asked, though.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ivana. I'm going to hand over to Barry again. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Niamh. And we're up against the clock. I want to give Professor Delap a moment in a few moments just to reflect on anything that's been said, if you'd like to, Lucy. But before that, Ivana, much of what I wanted to ask has been covered, which I'm delighted about. But one topic you mentioned briefly, which hasn't really been aired, is the European Union. And indeed, there's an argument to be made that the EU's had contributed to the transformative impact on Ireland, North and South, with respect to human rights that you spoke about, Articles 2 and 3 of the treaty, Charter of Fundamental Rights. You also mentioned that human rights are kind of being eroded, or at least being contested in certain parts of the EU, and some parts that you're familiar with. So just in as succinctly as you can you just reflect on the future of human rights in the EU and indeed Ireland's place in the EU? No biggie.
Yeah, no problem, Barry. In 2 minutes. No, well, we're anytime there's an opinion poll on the EU, we see quite strong support for the European project, I suppose. Although there's a strong Eurosceptic voice as well here, that we've seen a number of different referendums around Lisbon and Maastricht and so on over the years, so over those treaties. But I think probably the effect of Brexit has been to consolidate support for the EU in Ireland. I think that seems to be borne out by polls. What about human rights protections in the EU? Having said that, there isn't a strong move. There wouldn't be, I think, a strong appetite for for a more federalist Europe, and there's a strong sense of the need for subsidiarity in human rights protections here. So there's not, a lot of us got quite excited about the EU Charter of Rights, and about the potential for individual litigants before the ECJ. And actually, I've been a litigant at the ECJ because our case the case that Mary Robinson took on our behalf went to the ECJ on abortion information, and we had what we might describe as a partial victory. But I think in reality there's been somewhat of a slowing down of progress there, and a sense that the EU has to consolidate before taking on any other competencies, I would have thought. So I don't think there's huge appetite for it to go further, but there's huge support for it as an entity here.
Thanks, Ivana. There's another question in from Seanad Éireann, which I'll just have to share with you after the fact.
Hi, Sean.
Okay. It pertains to the Irish language, but just before that, it's a very important question, but I did promise, I think, Professor Delap, you're invited to, you don't have to, but if you want to respond to anything that's been said, I just wanted to give you a moment to do so.
Thanks, Barry. Well, I just wanted to reflect on how interesting this conversation's been, and the kind of the quality of the exchange and the ability to span academic realms and the political is really striking. I fear that one of the problems in the UK context has been the very harsh rhetoric around expertise and who gets to speak in public debates. And it is really fascinating that for all the kind of comments about we don't need experts, in fact, the pandemic has been an experience of recourse to certain kinds of expertise. I still think, though, that in a kind of parochial sense, for historians in the UK who want to get involved in public life, one of the problems for us is that most of our politicians think that they are historians and don't hesitate to write history books. So it's hard for us to get much of a look in. And in that sense, we feel somewhat excluded from public life. So I'm delighted to hear, Ivana, that there's all these kind of very powerful places in which the public can have their say and academics can have their say. And the deliberative ideal is so attractive to us, whether it's in discussions like this today or whether it's, trying to find alternatives to tweets and the negativity of public life. So I've been really inspired by that strand. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Lucy. We are going to wrap up presently because we always promise these meetings end within an hour, more or less. But just to say, Seanad Éireann's question is a good one. I'm just going to paraphrase it quickly and then leave Ivana to mull over it, and perhaps you can talk to Sean directly. Sean asks what your view is on language rights. Our Language Act, the Irish Language Act, is considerably behind our neighbours in Wales, for instance. That's despite the official constitutional protection of Gaeilge as our first official language. Just one of the many topics that we could have discussed with you, Ivana, but we haven't had the time to do so. It's been an enormous pleasure to hear about your incredible work and your contribution to public life, Ivana, and thank you for it. Just to mention very briefly that we have one more meeting next week. I've just shared a registration link to it. It's with Doug Beattie, the current leader of the Ulster Unionist Party and MLA for Upper Ban, which you're all warmly invited to. I should just say as well, Ivana, there was a nice note in from John Cushington with a couple of suggestions for you, which I'll also take enormous pleasure in sharing with you. The final word for me is that myself, Eugenio and Niamh are delighted to be continuing the series into the new year. And whilst we're still pinning down dates, just a handful of people who have agreed to speak, or we're delighted who will speak, include Tony Connolly from RTE, Lisa Dwan, who's the famous actor, dancer, and film director, famous interpreter of Beckett, amongst many other things, including Netflix's Top Boy. Jeffrey Donaldson, Jeffrey Donaldson MP, that was a slip, has agreed to speak, but we haven't confirmed a date yet. And there's also going to be an event with colleagues in Boston College on the American angle that I've been speaking about for months, but we still haven't quite pinned down a date. But just to say, there's plenty of things happening in the new year, and to thank you all for your time and for being with us. And most importantly, to thank Ivana again for being with us all. So without further ado, thank you all, and thank you very much to Professor Delap as well for the questions. Good night all. Good night with.